Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. Today's going to be a real special show. I don't usually do two joint movies together, but this is actually a show. I've talked about these movies in the past in other videos. I've talked a lot about, you know, my love of science fiction, my two favorite genres in the film world being horror and science fiction. And especially when it comes to, you know, horror and, the exploitation world. I've really, the last few years since I've dived into that entire genre, it's something I've always loved, but since I've gone down that rabbit hole, I've really discovered that that's the style of filmmaking that I love more than anything. So, but again, love all kinds of things, and I do lots of coverage of horror movies, and I try to do lots of coverage of a lot of epic science fiction movies that I love. Those two styles, whether it's a big Hollywood production or if it's some sleazy, underground grindhouse film, science fiction and horror related films are my favorite. And from a literary standpoint too, I love those styles have always been my favorite. So I always kind of go back to those styles all the time. I always I don't know, it's like a that well that I go back to get rejuvenated, and it quenches my thirst. So today's show is going to be a very different kind of format, and I'm going to be talking about kind of two movies back to back. And these movies are just incredible, especially the first one. And also, I'm going to, this show is also about sequels, and this sequel in particular that I think is just exceptional. And I think it's pretty rare, obviously, in the film world where you might have a film that comes out that just kind of sets a standard or raises the bar so incredibly high. And then sometimes there's obviously the situation where it will be a very successful movie, so they will want to create a sequel or even a franchise out of that film. And a lot of the times it's obviously not always the most successful thing that happens. There's definitely exceptions, but as a whole, it's hard to find a fully realized franchise where every movie has something to really contribute. But there is there are examples of that. But today's show is going to be about all things Blade Runner. I have Blade Runner: The Final Cut on Blu-ray. This is one of my most cherished possessions in the movie world. This is like kind of the definitive version of this amazing classic. I I can't even remember if I have or not. It's kind of funny, but I know I've talked about this film quite a bit, and I think I might have done a show on it to some capacity, but I have to check. But this is going to be a little bit of a different format. There's many versions of this film that exist. There's many different editions. I have multiple copies of this movie in different forms. So this will be the first movie I talk about, and then also Blade Runner 2049 with Ryan Gosling. This to me is one of the best sequels ever, and just an incredible movie. I got to see this in the theater. When this film was announced originally, I was super excited. So I'm going to be talking about this movie and also the source material where the movie's from, and there's so many things to talk about. Huge fan of this, probably one of the greatest science fiction movies ever. So and it's funny because I have such a long history with Blade Runner. And it all started like when I had seen Blade Runner when I was a kid and I liked it. And for some reason, um, I believe when I first saw Blade Runner, the original, of course, the original directed by Ridley Scott, and I think, Ridley Scott for me, when I look at Ridley Scott's career, I would say that this Blade Runner and Alien are probably easily the two best movies he's ever done in his career. Probably Alien being the best, but both films, Alien and Blade Runner, are just so breathtaking and so innovative, so ahead of its time. Two of the most influential movies, I think, in science fiction and horror. I think easily without Alien and Blade Runner, if either of those films were part of our world, the the shape and the scope of films would be really, really different. I think it's, one of they're both landmarks in cinema, and especially in those styles. I mean, without a doubt. And I remember, like as a kid, I saw Blade Runner when I was really, really young, and I think the first time I saw Blade Runner, I was, I don't know, probably 11 or 12, and I think I saw it on cable, or it was on TV somewhere, and I was always enamored with the effects and the look of the film. I never really, at that young age, I never really got into it to the degree of like a few years after that, or about that time, VHS had come out. I'm a product of the '80s, so I grew up through the VHS era. That was pretty much my introduction to how I watched films as a kid. And my parents are big movie fans. I actually had my mom on the show as a guest. She was probably the key person in my life that kind of got me into horror films. My dad has always loved films, but he's always had this weird relationship towards like horror movies. He's always been a little bit more squeamish, and if he I remember there were experiences when I was a kid or even younger, or I should say even not all that long ago, where he would use the certain horror films would give him nightmares. So he was always you know not going out of his way. He wouldn't go out of his way to watch them. My mom has always loved horror films, and sometimes he would leave the room when she would put a movie on. It's always funny, and we would just watch the movie, or he would like, do some other activities while the movie was playing. But I remember, when I was a kid and seeing Blade Runner, I think the and VHS came along when I my first recollection of movies you know was Beta. Beta was the basically the A track of how you would watch. That was an equivalent. The A track was like equivalent to like CD and records and digital streaming now. It was like the earliest stage, the earliest form, pretty much that how you could watch a film or rent a movie. And Beta was popular for a little while, but then it died. And then VHS came along, and that was a huge, huge thing for many, many years. And then eventually DVD. And my earliest recollection was, as a kid, was that like Beta had just kind of died, and I remember seeing Beta tapes. My dad knew a guy in our neighborhood, or in the area we that I lived in, or that I grew up on, which was grew up in, which was in New York, and this guy had a Beta rental store, and Beta basically had gone out of business. So this guy was pretty good friends with my dad, so he gave him all of his tapes. So he had boxes and boxes and boxes of VHS, or of Beta tapes. And I remember as a kid, watching movies that way. Beta had gone away at that point, And then, within 2 or 3 years, that was the explosion of where VHS became a thing. And suddenly there were, shops everywhere, mom and pop shops and different businesses selling and renting VHS tapes. And suddenly, it was this whole new experience of where you could go and like rent a movie and watch it, on your couch. You could watch a movie in the comfort of your own home. And if you had to like make popcorn or go to the bathroom, you could like pause it. It was a kind of a revolutionary time when you think about it. But and I remember seeing Blade Runner, and I think the reason I never really, I guess, fell in love with the movie at the time was because of the kind of the adult themes of the movie. It's very dark. It's a very slow movie. It has, it's a at that time I felt, well, when I learned more about the film and I developed a real passion for the film. At the time it was like a modern film noir. It was a dystopian, it was a very dismal and beautiful and tragic kind of a film, and very various themes that are more kind of adult oriented, and as opposed to like when I saw, say, like Star Wars for the first time, or Friday the 13th, where it's like pure entertainment and it's super fun, it's exciting, and films that those films weren't necessarily dealing with kind of the human experience, things that I just could care less about or never thought about, obviously, when I was a kid. So those movies I was always watching, and that's how I got into films more and more. So, in passing, I always knew what Blade Runner was. I had seen it, in the background, but I never went out of my way as a kid to watch it. And so I remember, I don't know when, it was years, it wasn't until years and years later, probably, I was like 18 or 19. And I got really into Blade Runner all of a sudden. I was in college. I had gone to college, and I had a couple of friends that were really into films, and Blade Runner would come up in conversation, and I remember always like hearing about it, and I was like, and then I remember seeing it at that time, and I was like, 18 or 19, and I just remember, I think I rented it on DVD at that point, and years and years had gone by, and I hadn't seen it, and I remember seeing it on DVD, and I was just like blown away by how incredible that this movie was. This movie was, and back then I used to be kind of a stoner. I used to, smoke pot all the time. I was a stoner throughout. I kind of started smoking pot when I was in middle school, and I had friends that were big time partiers, and we had the situation of where my friends had older brothers, so they could get us alcohol, and we partied a lot, and I partied at a pretty intense level when I was a kid, and I remember in college, I smoked a lot of pot. I never did any other drugs. I never had a desire to do drugs in general, and I always felt pot was pretty harmless in comparison. And I remember when I got out of college, I, during the time in college, I really got into film, and I started watching movies a lot with friends. And I was like, oh, yo, this is great. And I started getting into like who that director was, or like if I discovered a director, I was like, wow, what movies did he, you know, what did he direct? What other films? And I would make these kind of informal lists, and that was kind of how I got into movies, as far as like at a next, in at kind of going into the next level of that, and I became like a fan, and when I got out of college, I remember buying my first like DVD player. I kind of I was living at my folks for a few years during that time, and I remember I was living there, and I built or I bought a surround sound system, and I kind of had my first like official man cave. And my parents' house is pretty big, and they had a big downstairs, and I had like this entertainment room set up, and it was it was pretty cool. And so I had a DVD player with a pretty decent TV, and I had surround sound, and I had a subwoofer. It had four speakers, and I had this little room that was really comfortable and cozy, and it was in the downstairs of my house. And that when I got that system, that was when I started. That was the first time I started actually actively buying movies, and I started buying DVDs. And I started, and it was also when I had gone to school in Boston, and then my folks had moved to Maine, and then I eventually moved up here, and I started going to Opera House Video, which I still have a big relationship with, and I've talked about many, many times. And I started going there all the time, renting movies, and then I started buying DVDs. And I remember the first few movies that I bought on DVD were like what was Alien, of course Blade Runner, today's topic. I remember 2001: A Space Odyssey was another movie. I think the what other films did I buy? There was like a handful of movies that I bought, and I had this weekly ritual. Like again, I used to smoke pot 24/7. I'd get up in the morning, wake and bake, and be high all day, doing whether I had to go to work or whatever was going on. I was high all the time. But my favorite thing to do, and I worked a full time job at that time. I worked in a restaurant, and I worked full time. I worked a lot, and some days I remember I would go into work at 7 in the morning, and sometimes I'd be there till like 7:30 at night. And I did that like 5 days a week. Plus I was, playing in bands. I was playing in a few bands, and I was starting to play some gigs in the area and rehearsing and trying to practice. So I was, doing a lot of stuff at that age, and I worked a pretty grueling job for many years and had a pretty grueling schedule. And but Sundays were my days of where I would do nothing. I would literally, I my typical Sunday would be I would go to the local pizza place, Alexia's Pizza, which is still going in Belfast. I would go there, get a big pizza or a calzone or something, and I would get some beers, and then a lot of the times I would do it by myself. And then there were days too where I would call up some friends. I was starting to make some friends in the area, and I'd have them over, and typically what I would do is I would the movies that I owned or the movies that I rented, I would get super high, eat a bunch of pizza, eat a bunch of food, and watch movies and drink a bunch of beer. And one of the movies I used to watch all the time was Blade Runner. And that was one of my favorite movies to watch when I would get super high. That was like to me the ultimate kind of stoner movie. And again, I always loved this movie. I always loved it when I saw it as a kid, like I said. But the themes were over my head. But as an adult, I just really was enamored by the themes, and it was such a dark tale. It was my first exposure to like this kind of dystopian scenario. I loved how emotional it was, and during that time, I became a pretty avid reader, and I got into Philip K. Dick, was whose work was the inspiration for Blade Runner. And again, I became enamored with his work. I was reading his books all of the time and his short stories, and it was a magical time. And fast forward many years later, there has been so many rendition or versions of Blade Runner that have come out. There is I have multiple copies of it. I have it. I think I even have it on VHS. I have three or four editions of Blade Runner on DVD, and it wasn't until like probably 2 years ago that I bought this definitive version, which is the final cut. And to me, it's the greatest edition. There's the two kind of notorious versions of the film. There one where there's like voiceover by Harrison Ford, which was I think that was the theatrical version. Oh, I could be wrong. There's always been two versions of the film. There was one, the first version I remember watching and growing up seeing was the version without the voiceover, and then there was the second version that came out where there was all of this kind of narrative voiceover with Harrison Ford's character. And there's, many different editions of the film. There were extended cuts. And when I got this, I just, when I got this version, I was like, this is the definitive version. This is just amazing. This is one of my most prized possessions on Blu-ray. It's just incredible. Just incredible. Of course, this movie is adapted from Do Android's Dream of Electric Sheep. Electric Sheep, written by Philip K. Dick. This Blade Runner came out in 1982. Of course, it was directed by Ridley Scott. Sid Mead did all of the art direction for this film, who was another huge inspiration. He was the creator of like all of the graphic novels and kind of the early incarnation of the comic book world, like books like Heavy Metal. All of the design, uh, all of the designs of his creations were a huge, played probably the biggest part in constructing this universe. And Ridley Scott, this was his um, third movie actually that he directed. The first movie was The Duelist, which is a really awesome movie. He was basically discovered through that movie. He had a career before he became a director as where he made commercials, and he was based in London. He made various commercials, and he got picked. And then he made his first feature length film, The Duelist, and then he got picked to do Alien, and then that just after he did that film, it catapulted his career, and then he went on to direct Blade Runner, which is I think easily one of the greatest films ever, not only in the science fiction world. And of course, the cast. It was the first film I ever saw with Rutger Hauer, who went on to become one of my favorite actors. Harrison Ford, of course, Sean Young, Daryl Hannah, Edward James Olmos. I mean, just incredible. Uh, Brian James, just incredible. And this particular DVD has one of the greatest documentaries ever. That is just probably it might be the greatest you know documentary about what it's like to make a film. I mean, it's just absolutely incredible, and it's called Dangerous Days, and that's on this DVD or Blu-ray set, and it's such an in-depth documentary of the making of Blade Runner and how grueling you get. The sense that you get from watching this from watching the documentary is just so revealing and just so amazing, where you see how incredibly hard it was for Ridley Scott to create this completely unique movie with this, you know, vision, or showing this these creating this world and presenting it, that was unlike anything else in of its time. And of course, with all of the all of the work from a production standpoint, this is way before obviously any kind of computer generated images, light years before CGI. And Dangerous Days is just an amazing movie. It goes into so much detail on all of the tension that was on set, especially between the studio and Ridley Scott because of the level of detail that Ridley Scott wanted to bring to the film, and how the shoot was going over budget, and he was there numerous takes of each scene, and things were just being more and more drawn out, which caused all of this tension between Ridley Scott and Harrison Ford, where they were kind of at war with each other. Just amazing. And and it's one of the it's probably, I think, there's a lot of great movie documentaries out there, or special features, but I think Dangerous Days is probably the best one that I've ever seen, aside from the Alien Quadrilogy, which is the most extensive, where that is that those films or those docs are you know coverage of each Alien movie that is just amazing. Both of those, I would say that the Alien Quadrilogy and Dangerous Days are probably the best, but the Dangerous Days is probably just the most concise and kind of the most cohesive documentary about a movie, unparalleled. And again, I you can just learn so much. I've watched it countless times. And the other thing I should mention too, I always talk about my love of film and how movies are probably the most influential thing for me with my band Quantum. Quick plug: on Friday, Quantum will be playing in Thomaston, Maine, at the Hilltop Tavern, which is a brand new venue that just opened this past summer, and it will be our first gig playing there. So pretty excited about this spot. I've heard some really good things. I've been there once to check it out, and I had some friends that played there and said it was really great. But I like the spot a lot, and we'll be playing there at 8 o'clock this coming Friday. So if you're down or in that area, come on by, and it should be a good time. And then we have another gig coming up after that there. So this will be the first of a couple of gigs there. So yeah, it'd be a cool prospect. But getting back to the subject at hand, Blade Runner, like I said, for my band Quantum, movies and the obvious, there's obviously all kinds of musical influences, and as so many bands and artists that inspire the weird thing I do with Quantum. But movies play the biggest role as far as everything, as far as like the construction of the music that I write, the the aesthetics around kind of how we perform, with trying to always have some kind of theatrical element with the band. The and with the music, especially just with how the music gets put together, the pacing, the influences, the soundtracks I love. And I've always thought about it. It's something I think about a lot for some odd reason, and I've talked about it a lot. But the movies that there's like three movies. There's the three movies that I would say overall are the biggest inspiration for me when it comes to Quantum, are definitely like the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Without a doubt, such an influential movie for me, musically, artistically. The aesthetic that we try to create with the band with Quantum. The other two movies I say are just amazingly huge is Alien, also by Ridley Scott. massively inspirational in every way, and also Blade Runner. Like I would say, there's a lot. I mean, obviously, there's probably thousands and thousands of movies that are a huge part of, that are, play such a key component or components in influencing the band. But those three movies are, for me, head and shoulders above everything else as far as inspiration. Everything from the theatrical elements to the score of those films, the music in those films, the direction, the cinematography, the pacing. I mean, you have it. Uh, just so many things, and so Blade Runner is a movie that just really is part of my DNA and very very close to my heart. And even to the point too where we haven't done it in a while, but we used to use the first few years that when we started Quantum, we used to use a sample from Blade Runner. We would play this kind of sample from the original score composed by Vangelis. Obviously, one of the greatest. Blade Runner also has one of the most amazing soundtracks and film scores ever that was created by Vangelis. And we used to use that as a sample of how we would like as kind of like intro music for the band. So again, the amount of inspiration I've gotten from Blade Runner is just I almost can't explain it enough. Like it's pretty incredible. And again, like I said, I've many different editions of this film, but the final cut is the best one. Like it's the most extensive. I'm not a big fan of the version with the narration. Like it's cool to see. I do have the Blade Runner version with where Harrison Ford's character, uh, there is the voiceover, and it changes. The whole narrative is very different, and it kind of, I think it's kind of disingenuous to the fans and to the viewers because it kind of tells you what you know because the beauty of Blade Runner, I've always felt, especially around the ending, is that it's kind of ambiguous. It's kind of mysterious, and with the voiceover version, it always has this thing of where it's a little bit ham-handed, and you kind of left to feel that, oh, this is how it is. Of course, the voiceover by Harrison Ford, who plays Deckard, who is the Blade Runner. And I always feel it's a little bit ham-handed. It's cool though. It's definitely a version to check out if you love the film. It's like it's kind of part of history. But I love the version. This version is the greatest. It's longer. It's probably like 15 or 20 minutes longer than the original cut, and it has all, it leaves it more, especially the ending, and it has much more of an ambiguous ending, and it's amazing. I mean, it's a masterpiece. And the other thing too is like the transfer of this film. Obviously, this movie was shot on film back in the day, 1982. But the transfer of the original negative to DVD, I've never seen it in 4K, and I would imagine that would be so amazing it could give you a heart attack. But the transfer of this movie to Blu-ray is just astounding, astounding. It's literally jaw dropping, and I remember like having that experience of like when I first got this copy of this movie, of Blade Runner, the final cut. I couldn't believe it. It was literally like watching it for the first time, and there was nothing dated about it. Like it's unbelievable. Where everything you're seeing is practical effects. Everything is in camera, and just how uh, mind blowing it is to think how they pulled any of this stuff off. And it's Blade Runner commercially has a weird history because Blade Runner and then also the sequel that came out, 2049, which will be the next movie I'm going to talk about here, came out around a time. Blade Runner came out around the time when Star Wars came out, and it's in comparison, it's very dark, it's very heavy, and you know it it doesn't have the feel good themes that Star Wars has by any stretch, and so it bombed. It like this movie, the original when Blade Runner was when it first came out, it bombed in the box office. A lot of critics trashed it, and one of the biggest criticisms of Blade Runner was that it was a little bit too. Well, it was that it was too long, and that it was a little bit too art house, meaning that it was just too ambiguous, and there was too much. The, there wasn't enough dialogue, and the pacing was too slow, and there was too much of an emphasis on the visual thing. Critics who trashed it or criticized it at the time, and there's still people who say it now, but where they said that well, visually it's amazing, but story wise, it's not as strong as what you're seeing on the screen, and it totally bombed. It totally bombed in the box office, and it wasn't until quite a few years later when you had the drive-in theaters going, and it there was I think it was a few years after it came out, and it kind of went into obscurity. Blade Runner, it didn't make any money. It was a kind of a flop commercially, or it was a flop, and it was a lot of people didn't know what to think of it. They thought visually it was amazing, but they were just like, it's too cerebral, it's too dark, and this whole kind of thing. Uh, there were a handful of theaters that started playing this movie during like a midnight show for like midnight shows or midnight showings, and this buzz kind of started. And within a couple of years, DVD had come out, had emerged, and this movie started getting this huge cult following. And fast forward many, many years later, and now Blade Runner is regarded as one of the greatest science fiction movies ever, if not the greatest science fiction movie ever. When it comes to Ridley Scott's career, it's now regarded as one of his crowning achievements, and possibly his like masterwork, and it's gone on to, influence so many movies. It's unbelievable, unbelievable. And and when you think about what inspired this movie, it's pretty unbelievable. Where obviously the Philip K. Dick, the story which it was based on, but it was one of the first movies to kind of talk about tragedy in kind of a modern society, this kind of dystopian existence that the society lives in, or particularly in the film. The emergence of kind of corporatization of the world, of where corporations completely control everything from top to bottom. The the sense of alienation and the idea of like class warfare, the disparity between the classes. Just unbelievable. And this film borrowed so much from the obviously like the work of Sid Mead. Sid Mead, where you had the heavy metal comics that came out. It took all the aesthetics from that, and then like I mentioned too, film noir. A very amazing style that kind of came to Hollywood in the 40s and 50s, where it was like kind of the emergence of like the anti-hero, where there's like a central figure or character who is in it for himself. He has these traces or shades to his character where he's kind of ambiguous. He's not really the good guy, he's not really the bad guy. He's got all of these attributes to his character. And a lot of film noir films have scenes of where it doesn't necessarily have the stories don't necessarily have an ending. They They are kind of tragic stories. A lot of times, everyone dies at the end. It's all black and white. There's a lot of people smoking, and it deals a lot with, to a degree, a reality of how people are. They have these different shades, and there isn't this definitive good or bad. And and everybody's fending for themselves, struggling. So, film noir had a huge influence on this film. And so, it was unlike anything else. And I think even today, like again, watching when I first bought Blade Runner, it was truly, when I first saw it on Blu-ray, this version here, it was truly a transcending experience. I mean, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I had seen it, billions of times before, and it was, it's amazing how much it holds up. Like it feels like it came out today. Like it's one of the greatest movies ever. Even outside of the world of science fiction, and its influence. When the film eventually gained an audience and gained the popularity, rightfully so. The influence that it's had on movies is just astounding. On so many science fiction movies, probably the biggest one I can think of is The Matrix. I mean, which is probably the greatest action movie ever made. But the amount of influence that Blade Runner's had on culture, introducing kind of the whole cyberpunk world to culture. All cultures, and this dystopian vision of the future, and visually, just so far reaching, astounding. It's just astounding. It's easily, I think, the two greatest movies I think Ridley Scott's ever done is Alien and then Blade Runner. I mean, his career has definitely changed a lot in the last 15 or 20 years, but he was at the height of his power in the 80s. I mean, just amazing. He went on to direct Legend, I think after this. I mean, he made some incredible movies, especially early on in his career. Just, unprecedented. Unprecedented. So fast forward many, many years later, one of my favorite modern directors is Denis Villeneuve. He is, I kind of feel like he is, up there with like Stanley Kubrick or, Roman Polanski or Martin Scorsese. Just, I think, one of the greatest directors working today. And he's able to bounce around with different genres, horror and suspense, thrillers, science fiction, you name it. And so and I love all of his films. There isn't one movie that he has directed that I don't love. And he most recently directed Dune, which is just the greatest version of that story ever. It's just so spectacular. Just amazing. So I remember a few years back when it was announced that he was going to be directing the Blade Runner sequel, I was like, my jaw dropped, because I'm like, if anybody's going to do something so incredibly crazy and ambitious and could probably totally pull it off, it would be Denis Villeneuve. Um, just unlike any other director right now, and the amount of detail that he brings to the screen, from the production of his films to the characterizations, you know, just astounding, just astounding. So I was beyond excited when I had heard about it, and the movie was, I think, delayed for various reasons. It was pushed up. It was announced, and then it wasn't until like maybe almost 2 years later when the film finally came out. So the anticipation, at least for me, to see Blade Runner the sequel was like, I think now that I think of it, and it's been a few years, I think for me it was probably the most anticipation that I ever had to see a film, especially around like kind of a sequel kind of scenario. unlike anything. And I did finally I did see it in the theater, and it came out in 2017 already, which is just crazy. And I remember going with a couple of friends to see it in the theater, and I was completely blown away by it. I thought it was fresh, it was innovative, it it gave you, it paid homage obviously to the original. Ridley Scott was involved with Blade Runner 2049. It was a great tribute to that film, but it gave you something totally new and unique. It was like a really good continuation of the story. The characters were just amazing. The visual element of the film, the music was just astounding. I was like, I was completely blown away by seeing it in the theater. And you know, both films are very long; they're close to 3 hours. And Hans Zimmer did this soundtrack for Blade Runner 2049, which I like Hans Zimmer. I think the work he's done, especially with Christopher Nolan, some of the stuff he's done for that film, for Christopher Nolan's films, is really incredible. But I kind of feel like Interstellar is probably my favorite music that he's done for a film. The Dark Knight or the Batman movies is really great, obviously. I really love the work he did on 2049. And so it was such a thrilling experience. I mean, such a thrilling experience. And talk about feeling like it was a great payoff and it was very satisfying. And it was such an immersive experience. And and it brought back Harrison Ford's character, Deckard. And of course, I've always been a big fan of Ryan Gosling. I think he is, probably one of the best actors around and has been. He can do comedies, he can do action, he can do, all kinds of things. And he is just a really great actor. So I've always been a big fan of his. This film also starred Anna de Armas, Sylvia Hawkes, and Mackenzie Davis, and Robin Wright. Um, and again, just amazing, just an amazing film. And I bought Blade Runner 2049. I bought this bad boy on Blu-ray probably a couple of years ago. It's hard to believe this came out in 2017. Jesus, time goes by. But I bought it on Blu-ray, and again, it's one of those experiences where I remember seeing this in the theater, and I was just Jared Leto is just in this too, and he is just for me and for my money, like I really love Jared Leto. He's just an incredible actor. He's one of those guys I feel as an actor that he can be in movies that are not very good, but he is just so terrific in it. He's just just awesome. And for me, this is my favorite role of his. Um, just incredible. And when I bought this about 2 years ago, before I bought this on Blu-ray, I had seen it quite a few times. I saw it in the theater when it came out, and then I rented it a bunch of times after that. And I remember when it first came out on for rental, I rented it on Blu-ray, and I was just like, wow, like this is just amazing. And I've probably seen it about 5 or 6 times before I bought this. And again, this is a really great addition. There's a lot of great special features on here. It goes into pretty big detail about the whole like creation, and kind of you get a sense from the filmmakers, especially with Denis Villeneuve, kind of the pressure of what he was embarking on. I mean, when you think of he's such an ambitious director, he's willing to tackle these like monumental things that could be just a disaster. Like with Dune and then with Blade Runner. where you have so much expectation and there's already versions of the story and all of these precedents kind of set, and he can tackle it and be so successful, and it's just incredible. When I finally bought this version, I was just like, and I watched it, and I was just like, again, that same experience of where it was like watching for the first time, and it was just, you know, an incredible experience. And I think it's one of the greatest sequels in movie history. There's examples of that, obviously. Probably the other one that's one of the greatest, if not the greatest sequel, is James Cameron's sequel to Aliens, which is a masterpiece. But a lot of the times it's not the case, and I think with Blade Runner 2049, it was amazing. It's just an amazing feat accomplished by Denis Villeneuve. And you think too of the length of time between movies. I mean, years and years and years, and to finally have it happen. And there have been rumors of this movie for years, and then for it to come out, and for me, for it to be just an incredible experience, was such a great payoff for me personally. Being such a fan, like just just amazing. And the other thing that is so crazy, which I feel ties these movies together even more, these both of these movies have followed the same trajectory. Blade Runner 2049, when it came out, it totally bombed in the box office. Totally bombed in the box office. As far as for my what I can remember, it did get some really good reviews. I think the overall reviews that it got compared to the original Blade Runner were more favorable. But nobody saw this movie. It bombed. It totally bombed in a box office. And since it's been out for a few years, I see more and more now people are like, wow, like this movie, we should check this movie out again. It's really freaking good. I know a few friends too that do love Blade Runner, and they didn't like it either. They thought one of the biggest two of the the some of the criticisms was that it's boring, it's too long. That's also one of the criticisms of the original, that it's just too long, it's too um, things are just too drawn out. And if it was edited in a different way, it could be more cohesive. I mean, the runtime for Blade Runner 2049 is close to 3 hours, but to me, it's like it's magic. I don't want it to end. I'm totally into it. It's very much a slow paced movie, and that's kind of the part of the world, especially with what Ridley Scott did when he created Blade Runner, is it has this very slow paced kind of meticulous thing, and it works, I think. But I think it's one of the greatest sequels in movie history, and I just think it's wonderful. Last year, I watched both movies back to back. I think it was on like a Saturday or probably Sunday. I watched both. I started out with watching Blade Runner, and then I watched 2049 back to back, and it was awesome. I found myself loving 2049 even more, and even Blade Runner. But I found myself falling in love more with the just how cohesive both stories are. And the other thing that's really really interesting, getting back to the source material by by Philip K. Dick, I read after I saw Blade Runner 2049, I read the original story again, and I was amazed on how I feel this movie is actually even closer to the story by Philip K. Dick. There's actual scenes, especially the opening sequence in this movie, is directly taken from the original source material, which Ridley Scott didn't do. He took big time liberties with the story. But Danny Villeneuve actually took whole scenes from the original source material by Philip K. Dick and put that in this movie. And the whole opening sequence, which is so awesome, is directly from the book. And it so I was like, wow, like that's amazing. That's amazing. But yeah, I can't say enough about these movies, and especially Ridley Scott's masterpiece. You know, legendary films. So thanks again, and we will chat again soon. Peace.